Hi, Dave.
Who?
Who? Are you there?
I'm here. Hi.
Bueller?
Yeah.
Hey,
This,
I got a wreath. You didn't even say anything about it. It's Christmas time.
well, yeah, you got a reason. I didn't say anything because it's all fuzzy.
I know.
Oh, sorry.
Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 4, really just an extension, actually, of episode 3. And due to the fact that often Dave and I have a pre-conversation and also a post-conversation when we record. And so this episode 4 actually comes out of this conversation that we had after we recorded episode 3. So we're really excited to bring it here to you. Dave told me this is going to be his worst one, though. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Don't look too forward to it, I guess.
People would never believe this, but you know it's true. Every talk I've ever given in my life, I thought going in, this is good. This is it. I'm done. This is over. I have nothing at all. Anyway.
And we'll just leave it at that. We won't let you any further into the scary mind of David Johnson.
The disease of
Well, again, we're excited to be here and continue talking to you about this theme that we have. And this we talked about is an extension of episode 3. And we again talked about in episode 3, this pattern, this cycle of God's people in the Bible from the beginning to the end. And the cycle that they have is they forget who they are. They forget whose they are. And they forget why they're here. They lose sight of their mission. And every time they do that, they go into exile. So we spent some time talking about exile and what
in reality, like exile that was real, but also symbolically as well. Yeah, exile is kind of a symbol. Keep going. Sorry.
Right. Well, and it goes from the beginning of God's story to the end. And the end is even here with us present day. We are part of that story. But this exile always gave way to an awakening. And that was episode 3. We talked about revival, right? And we kind of picked on it a little bit because what it reminds me of are the tent revivals and Billy Graham crusades and all the different ways that Christians across time have used that word. But you're going to pick it up right here because we're going to continue to talk about revival, but in a little different way. So I'm going to pass the microphone to you.
Okay, thank you. Now I have it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, the distinction about revival that we talked about last time was that the revival that we experienced and the tent revival that you were talking about and we were picking at a little bit was that it was almost always individualistic, my individual sin. And I don't want to eliminate that. I think that's great, but we never got into what the prophets talked about when they talked about more systemic kinds of things. So anyway, but before I go back to that and kind of weave it into this second part of this episode, I want to touch on this cycle again, this pattern of forgetting that we've talked about and we did say this in the last episode, because by the time Jesus came onto the scene, this was like a cycle of their life of exile and restoration, of slavery and freedom, bondage and deliverance, identity and mission, only to give way eventually again to self-indulgence and sin. And now we're back to bondage and exile all over again. And so there's this cycle that was part of their life. It was kind of like their DNA. It's part of their experience. Yeah, it was so ingrained in them that if you were in first century Israel, if you were to ask a first century Jew about what it meant to be saved, like we use the word, are you saved? And how, you need to be saved. They wouldn't be thinking of avoiding hell, because when we talk about being saved, you want to be saved from hell. They wouldn't be thinking about hell then, sometime when I die. They would be thinking about the hell they're in right now. They would be thinking about the exile they're experiencing right now. They think about the oppression. In Jesus' day, it would have been the oppression they were experiencing from Rome, the slavery they experienced in Egypt now. And they would not be talking, if you talked about being saved, they wouldn't be talking about being saved so they go to heaven when they die. That just wasn't on their radar. They would be talking about being saved from slavery. So they would be talking about a Messiah who would come and bring restoration and freedom particularly from their exile and from their oppression. And it would happen now. The kingdom of heaven is within your reach right here, right now, said Jesus, which we'll kind of unpack a little bit later. And they would not talk about being saved once. That's another thing that I'm just aware of in our language as evangelicals. Are you saved? Well, yeah, I am. No, I guess I'm not. Yeah, it's a box you check off and you're saved, or you're not. That's not, those aren't categories that people, first century Jews, the people that Jesus showed up to and brought the message of the kingdom. And that's important for us to understand, because if we're thinking different than them, we might want to recalibrate our thinking a bit, because they would be aware, based on their history and their experience, of a need to be saved several times. Not so you go to heaven when you die, but because they would forget who God is and who they were and why they were here several times. So they would need to remember several times in the course of their life, in the course of a day. I mean, I don't want to go off into another talk, but when we talk about spiritual practices that help us center every day, we're remembering every day. Why? Because we forget every day. And so we would be saved in that sense every day. It's not about heaven when you die. We're talking about I don't know if it's a bigger or smaller category, because they were just aware of this need for restoration, and they needed it over and over again. And my point is, so do we. And I think our experience affirms that we do need to remember over and over again and be restored over and over again, because we forget over and over again who we are, whose we are, why we're here. And every time we do, just like you just said, we go into exile of some sort. It doesn't mean we go to Babylon or Egypt, but we're far from home. We know what that feels like. We're east of Eden. Something's wrong. You can't even name it. Something's just, we're in exile. We're not centered. Okay. It's part of our life. It's not just theirs. And every time you do go into exile, what you need to do, the cure, as you already mentioned, was they needed to, and so do we, remember and return first of all to God, return to me with all your heart, the prophet Joel said, then returning to our identity as a people of God, and then also returning to our mission as the people of God. But sometimes, and we'll unpack this more as we go on, sometimes we're off mission and we don't know it. And that's where it gets really down and dirty, and we have time to unpack that and get me in trouble later. So, but every time the people of God or we remember who we are and why we're here and whose we are, the people are revived. And you touched on this already. Like someone sleeping, they're awakened. I love that metaphor of revival, even though we did make fun of it a little bit. To be revived is to be someone who's like groggy, and like a splash of cold water comes in. Now you're alert and you're awake, and all of a sudden you start seeing things you didn't see. You see people you didn't see. You care about things you didn't care about, because now you see it. You see them. And that's the awakening piece of this. And what I said last time was that historically, biblically, Old Testament-y, that was always, whenever the people of God remembered these things, it was always good news for the poor, for the marginalized. It was always good news for the other, for someone other than myself, because when the people of God are asleep, we don't see anything but ourselves. We don't see that. We don't see anything. But now when we're awakened, we're back on mission, and because we can see what we couldn't see and who we couldn't see, which brings me to today. Okay, all of that was for, I don't know.
It's just the intro. It's just the intro.
It was to waste your time. Yeah. Warm me up. But this extension you talked about, called it, this illustration, is really embodied in three places. So I'm going to talk about three places that are real places in Scripture, and they speak metaphorically of this forgetting and remembering and losing mission and finding it and all that kind of stuff. First place is Egypt. I'll unpack that. Second place is Sinai. Unpack that. The third place will actually be the city of Jerusalem, But the big story on the third place is that it's under the rule and reign of Solomon. So at that place, they're at the top of their game. I'll get to that in a minute. Egypt is first. Okay, just get in your mind. Egypt was and is a real place. It was about real people, and there were real slaves, and it was real miserable. It was a real thing. But Egypt, like for this talk, it's also a metaphor that speaks symbolically to not just slavery, but the fact that there's two kinds of slavery. So they were slaves, and that was real. But Egypt also speaks symbolically to two kinds of slavery or two kinds of sin. The first, talked about this last week with revival things. The first was individual sin, the personal sin or personal slavery, because all of us have an Egypt. All of us have Egypts, if you will. That symbolically are those places in our life, those patterns in our lives where we're enslaved in some weird way. We wouldn't necessarily use those words, but to anger, that's our go-to thing. That's your Egypt. Or fear, that's your Egypt. You just can't it's your go-to thing. It's like you have become enslaved to that, to lust, to a need to control. I think a great word that doesn't require a lot of explaining, that isn't a personal Egypt, is any addiction. You're enslaved. Okay, that's an Egypt for you, and you need a deliverance, and you might need more than one. I mean, that's incredible how the metaphor kind of carries over, and so that's that one aspect of Egypt that ties into last episode's talk about this individual thing and revival. The second was that Egypt is also a symbol of and the embodiment of systemic sin or slavery. Where people get exploited and oppressed, and sometimes they would be exploited and oppressed in God's name, but it would be systemically or systematically. They would be held down, kept out. There are religious systems that hold people down, that keep people out. So this is systemic stuff. It's just the air that we breathe. They're systemically, as it were, enslaved. I mean, one of the things I wrote down here, and I don't want to get lost in this, but women have been systemically. There are systems that have kept women down and held them out in churches. So it's part of a cultural system. It's part of a religious system. It's a systemic thing. And when you get free from it, it's almost when you're in it, you don't even see it. When you get free from it, you look back and you go, there's a system there that's keeping that going. That's Egypt. Are there systemic things like that? One thing that helps me to understand it is and help other people understand is think of the isms in the world. Communism, it's a system. Okay, capitalism is a system. Racism is a system. It's something that systemically holds people down, keeps people out, and it can have a happy, smiley face. But if it's systemic, it's a kind of slavery. It's really weird because racism is weird because we have a history of that in our country with actual slavery. It isn't a symbol; it's actually real. A word that we're hearing a lot lately is nationalism. And even Christian nationalism, which is like this system of believing that our life is going to be found when we make America great again. Well, we need to define great, not in terms of the culture, but in terms of how Jesus defines great. But those are all systemic kinds of things. By the way, that I just did have a memory around Christian nationalism, and I don't want to do the whole talk. I just saw the camera move. Anyway.
Oh, I just moved mine.
Okay. Anyway, Palm Sunday, you know my take on Palm Sunday, that Jesus was coming into the city and there was a nationalistic fervor going on in Jerusalem. And what they wanted to be was out from under the oppression of Rome. And what they wanted was a Messiah who would free them from that militarily. And I have this picture in my mind that everybody in Israel, in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday was wearing a light blue MAGA hat. Make Israel great again. Not make it America great, make Israel great again. And that's when you're in the middle of that, that feels right and good and noble, and it's fine. It's not the kingdom. It's not the kingdom Jesus was bringing. That was the disconnect on Palm Sunday, and why the crowd turned from Hosanna, Hosanna, save us now. And when they found out he wasn't gonna, they said, crucify him, crucify him. That's a whole nother talk. I'm going ADD crazy here on this stuff. There are religious systems. There are political systems, economic, governmental. There are family systems. That's even a good way to think about it, because all of a sudden, some of these things sound so big: communism, capitalism. There are family systems that hold people down, hold people out, that crush the human spirit. And in every one of these systems that push people down and hold people out, and they do it systemically, because there are family systems that do that. They're not even aware of the dynamics all the time. The only way to get free is you need a Messiah. You need a deliverer of someone like an Annika who stands up in the family. I mean, this is as earthy as that, as somebody enough with this. Dad, you're abusive, or who calls it out, and says, let my people go. We're not going to live this way anymore. And there's always been a yearning in people's hearts for that person in a family. Who's going to stand up and stop this? In a church, who's going to stand up and stop this? Who's going to be that Messiah-like figure? I hope this is making sense, because these are really big typal things, but they get right down into how we talk around the kitchen table.
Right.
It's just a little bizarre. Okay. So they need someone who says enough. So Moses would be an example of who said enough. Jesus would be pretty good example of someone who said this, what he scribes and Pharisees, all this looking good on the outside with nothing of reality on the inside. Enough of that, enough. And he paid with his life,
right,
for that. So that's Egypt. Real place, real slaves, but symbolically as well, of a symbol of individual sin. And we all have our Egypts, but also of systemic sin. And it's a very real thing in the world we live in today. Second place that I want to visit is Sinai. Sinai is where people got the law. We know about that. Moses went up to the mountain, came down with the 10 Commandments. But in some ways, I don't want to say it's more important, but more fundamental to the whole thing it was at Sinai that the people of God got their identity as a people, and they got their mission as a people. Exodus 19, verse 5 says, you have been called a people for God's own possession, a royal priesthood and a holy nation. Isaiah 49 and Exodus 19 both refer to them as a light unto the nations. So a people for God's own possession is about identity. You belong to God. It's who you are. It's who you are. And a light unto the nations is mission. We're to be a light unto the nations. In other words, I didn't redeem you, Israel, from Egypt, from that oppressive system of Egypt, to become an exclusive club of redeemed people. I rescued you so that you might become rescuers of other people. I rescued
like mic drop.
Mic drop, boom. Yeah, right. But you can see how the shift is, and you can feel it in your own spirit. Like, he redeemed me, and I'm better than you. No, he didn't redeem you so you could feel better than them. He redeemed you so you could redeem them, so you could rescue, so you could bring this life that you have to other people. You didn't rescue them. I'm talking Egypt now, Old Testament. Liberate you to just feel liberated. He liberated you to become a liberator, to become someone who is a repairer of the breach. Remember the Old Testament stuff last week. You shall become repairers of the breach, the builders, the restorers of the ancient cities, people who are rebuilding the world, tikkun olam. It's very, very earthy. It's not just heaven when you die. It includes that.
Yeah,
it's bigger than that. So a people who, having been delivered from this oppressive system, we become confronters of systemic sin wherever we see it. And that would be, when you're doing that, you're on mission. If we're aware of and confronting systems that push people down and hold people out. And we can't do them all, but God is going to make you aware of the places I need to say enough in this family, in this context, this school, this church, whatever, where you see those systems that push people down, hold people out. We need to be part of that. Then you're on mission, which leads to the third place. And this is very fascinating to me. It's found in 1 Kings 10, and this is Jerusalem. Excuse me. And King Solomon is on the throne, and basically in 1 Kings 10, with Solomon on the throne, the people of God have given you Egypt, given you Sinai. Well, when we're in 1 Kings 10, they're at the top of their game. They know who they are, they know whose they are, and they are on mission. It looks like that as well, at least from the outside. And so much so do they look to be doing great that in 1 Kings 10:8, the Queen of Sheba comes to meet with King Solomon. It's a fascinating story. You could look it up later. 1 Kings 10, verse 8. She makes this observation, speaking to Solomon: how blessed are your men, and how blessed are your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. They used to say that at staff meetings to me. Not really.
You wish.
Who stand before you and hear your wisdom day by day.
Yeah.
He continues, blessed be the Lord your God. So here's this Queen of Sheba, a pagan, if you will, not a follower of God, going, blessed be the name of your God. So she's kind of being converted. She's saying, your God is God. So we're on mission. We're becoming good news to others. Okay.
Yeah.
Blessed be the Lord your God, who obviously has delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever and made you, Solomon, king, in order to do justice and righteousness. To do justice and righteousness, there's your mission. There's your mission. So the Queen of Sheba comes in and says, I see something here that she didn't say you're on mission. She said, it's obvious that God has called you, made you king of Israel forever, to do justice and righteousness, because that's what you're doing. That's what she saw. So it looks like they're on mission in a big way. And it looks like they're being a light to the nations. This is the Queen of Sheba who was saying, like, this is what I see. You're like amazing. But something is off in this story. If that's all you see and hear as the praise of the Queen of Sheba, who is someone you actually want to have, like, isn't it cool to have a celebrity like the Queen of Sheba saying, your church is the best? It's a dumb illustration, but it's kind of like that. But there's something off in the story if you're paying attention closely, and it shows up in 1 Kings 9:15. 1 Kings 9:15 says this. It's almost hidden. It's not hidden. This is what I love about the Bible, Annika. All the warts, all the flaws, nothing's hidden. It's all, I know people struggle with the Bible sometimes because there are some weird things, but there's nothing hidden. All the weird stuff, it's there. Here's what's going on in the context of them being at the top of their game. This is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of God, to build the temple. And if you remember the story, but David had a heart to build the temple, the offering for the temple, but God said, no, you're not going to build a temple, because he had blood on his hands. Violence was his legacy relative to that. But he built the house of God and his own house, and he rebuilt the city of Milo, Hazer, Megiddo, and Gezer, meaning he did the Old Testament thing. He rebuilt the ancient ruins, the old cities. In very practical ways, he's rebuilding the cities, but what's off here is this is the account of the forced labor. 2 words, forced labor. What is that? Slaves. Why are you laughing at slavery?
I smell trouble.
You're laughing, okay, and you're laughing at me. No, the forced labor this is the account of the forced labor, meaning he built the temple of God in the name of God. That's the name of this whole thing we're doing. What in God's name is going on? Well, in God's name, he built a temple, but he didn't do it with God's help. He did it with slaves. He rebuilt his own house. He did all these good things the wrong It's like take your breath away, wrong. Because part of the history of the people of God, Israel, who belong to God, is that this is what's so like incongruous, having been slaves, they have them now. Now they have slaves.
It's unbelievable.
It is. Because in all of their Jewish festivals, Passover being one of the biggest and most obvious, even today in the Jewish festivals, the key word throughout the festival is remember. What? When we were slaves. We need to remember when we were slaves. We need to remember continually what it felt like to be a slave, which means sadly that they've forgotten. Where's that cycle again? And there's my camera moving again.
Yep.
Anyway, but what it means is that having been slaves, they now have slaves. And this is really sad. It just means that they're like every other system. Here we have people of God, looks like they're at the top of their game. The Queen of Sheba goes, I'm amazed, very impressed. But now they're like every other system. They're a Jewish version. Okay, if I were to update it, I'm concerned about the Christian versions of every other system, be it political, religious, economic, I don't care, that uses power and position and wealth to exploit, oppress, use people to get what I want. And that's just like every other system. It's just a Jewish version of that system, or a Christian version of that system that makes you start asking this question: what in God's name is going on there? Because it's in God's name. You built a temple, Solomon, but you use slaves to do it, and it matters how you do it. But hey, now I don't know how to put in my brain, imaginatively what I see in my head, but the Queen of Sheba was impressed, so it must be okay.
Right.
I got an article in the paper last week about our church or about our event, whatever it is. So it must be okay. They were impressed. She was particularly impressed with Solomon's wealth. Again, even acknowledging the Hebrew God as being the one true God. But what's weird about that is as she's extolling Solomon and that the Hebrew God is the one true God, Solomon was no longer providing an accurate picture of who God was.
That's for sure.
But isn't that weird? Because Bathsheba was not Bathsheba, the Queen of Sheba. Sheba was in there somewhere.
It's a different Sheba.
Anyway, forget it. But it wasn't an accurate picture of who God really is, because God didn't build the temple. Slaves did. God didn't build the wall in Jerusalem. We put God's name on it, but slaves built that wall. And God was not the energy behind building his house, and even these cities of Gezer and whatever they were, slaves built those things. And Solomon's greed built those things. Solomon did not end well. When I'm talking to go all into that, because right now I'm talking about some of the systemic things he did, but he had personal stuff as well. It was bad. But all that raises a couple of things, and I'll close with this and we can talk. First is an observation. When you put this whole Solomon place of Jerusalem looking like they're at the top of their game, but they've got slaves, meaning they've forgotten who they are and where they're from and whose they are and why they're here. They're not here to enslave people. They're here to liberate them. Get worse. But they look good, which the observation, therefore, is that it is possible to be successful and look great and be in exile at the same time. And that's sobering. Like, just sit with that. I mean, even bring it as a question. Is it possible to be successful, look great, and be in exile far from home at the same time? And that's a tough one, because if you're in Egypt and you're a slave and you're, in dry, and what's not hard to identify exile. This is horrible. I hate it here. But what if you're at the top of your game, but you've forgotten who you are? What if you're at the top of your game and you've forgotten who you are and why you're here and what the mission is? And so who cares if we cut a few corners and lie here and there and just do it for show? It matters. It matters. It is possible to be at the top of your game, to look successful and be in exile. That's a good, you could take the rest of the night if you're in a Bible study group, talk about what that looks like when you've maybe experienced that or seen that. When I think of the megachurch scandals that we talked about, I think in the first episode, the megachurch scandals were exposed, and most of them got exposed when they were at the top of their game. Everybody's going, they're unbelievable. Lines around the block to hear that guy preach.
Right.
In exile, long before he got exposed. Do I sound angry?
I won't answer.
Yeah. That Southern Baptist Convention cover-up of sexual abuse for 20 years, protecting the institution so that maybe the Queen of Sheba would come and go, you guys are the biggest Baptist. But they're in exile the whole time. Didn't even know it. Maybe you don't even know it now. I don't know. Second is a principle. So that was an observation. It's possible to be successful and in exile at the same time. Second is a principle that whenever we use or resort to a kingdom of this world method, okay, a kingdom of this world method relative to Solomon would be to use slaves. And that's, if you have slaves, you're power over. Because they're doing what I want. I'm using them, exploiting them, oppressing them. So whenever, wherever we use a kingdom of this world method to accomplish what we even are calling a kingdom of God outcome, building the temple for God in the name of God. If you use a kingdom of this world method, like a slave or exploitation or manipulation, you lose the kingdom. I don't care how good it looks. You lose the kingdom. That's the second thing. So first was an observation. Second was a principle. Third is a question. Where are we in the story? I mean, that would be some, where are we in the story? What's, can I identify in Egypt of mine right now? Like, it's personal. Now, we kind of made fun of the revival. It was all personal. Well, we have to do that work too. Do I have some personal Egypts that I'm ignoring? It's a good question to ask. What is my place of exile? Sinai, there's that place of identity and mission. Solomon's Jerusalem. Have I forgotten? Have we forgotten? There's a we here that needs to be brought in as well. It's not just me. It's not just in, but have we forgotten who we are and why we're here, and all of these things about why, how we do what we do matters. And I'm rambling now. So I'll just end with this. And it kind of brings us back to, I think, where we started in the first episode. It's time again to listen to the prophets, who over and over and over again, when the people of God would forget who they were and whose they were and why they were here, they would say, remember and return. Return to me with all your heart. Rend your hearts from their garments. Remember who you are and whose you are and why you're here. And every time they did, they'd be revived. And every time they were revived, awakened, they were back on mission. And because they weren't sleeping anymore, they saw the other, and that was their mission. And it wasn't all about them. And boom. That's it. That's all I got for that one.
That's all.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
What the question that it's leaving me with as you finished there was, like, who are you listening to? Because we still have prophets that are speaking. And so I'm just wondering, like, and even for myself, like, who am I listening to? Because am I listening to someone who is saying, remember? Are you remembering? Are you actively remembering? Did you forget again?
Yeah.
Or am I listening to someone that has just a quick, easy solution for the exile I find myself in?
Yep.
Right? Whatever that is. That a financial exile? Is it a relational
Well,
exile?
They might even be inviting you into an exile, because the solution they're giving you, that quick and easy solution you described, will bring you into exile.
This is such a good point.
Quick and easy thing is rarely the thing that brings life or freedom. Or, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were onto something there.
No, I mean, you're just extending kind of what I really was just kind of raising this question that I don't really have an answer to beyond I need to be paying attention to the things and the people and the prophets that I'm listening to.
Yeah.
And I think it's even more important now than even just 10 years ago because our world just gets noisier and noisier and noisier. And I'm more and more aware of it. Maybe it's getting older, I don't know, but there is so much that I can let in, that I can listen to, whether it's the news or the social media or the books or the texts even from friends. It's just constant.
Yep.
Um,
I
so who
think,
am I gonna listen to?
yep.
I don't know.
Well, I think that's brilliant. I mean, that really does get to the core. Like, what are because I want to say things that you just already said, and I'm just going to be redundant again. Anyway, I remember saying this at Open Door years ago. There's voices everywhere. There's
Yeah.
and Annika, it is more now than it
Hmm.
was. Social media. There are things and avenues and ways of communicating with people that are so quick and so fast and so cut off from any real relationship, actually,
Yeah.
that we hear all sorts of voices and all of them are screaming. And this even reminds me of what we talked about when we were doing the center. So with all of the voices that are calling us and promising us and inviting us, how do we hear the one?
Yes.
How do we hear the one voice? And the only piece of advice I'd have on that one, really quick, and it really is a good piece of advice: turn down the volume, turn some stuff off. I mean, off, not even just down. There's some stuff you need to quit listening to.
Yeah.
Voices, like, you know what? I don't trust that voice. I'm gonna quit listening to that voice. And that could
Yep.
be like what you're saying, a news feed of some sort. I got to quit listening to that voice, because there's things that stir things up in me, but it isn't this. Remember that you were a slave, and we're not here to be free. We're here to free
Yes.
other people. That's why we're
It's what you said in the last episode. Like, if it's not good news for the poor, it's not good news.
right.
If our faith is not resulting in an outward expression of hope for somebody else, that's not a solid faith, right? That's not what God intends for us, for it
Well,
just to be a navel gaze, feel good experience.
right.
Um, yeah, I don't even know how to close this out because I just want to keep talking. I have so many thoughts and questions, and we haven't even touched on. I haven't even gone back to the three places that you talked about, which are Egypt, Sinai, and Jerusalem, and the significance that each of those have with our own personal lives and what that even means. So I don't know. Probably result in another episode and a chat after I stop
Absolutely.
recording.
Yeah. And we're going to start. This is the fourth one, and so we're going to. If people are listening to this, they've listened to the last three, I hope, and it might be appropriate now to start asking for people who are listening to this to send us some questions. I mean, it could shape some of what we end up talking about down the road. So anyway.
Yeah, and maybe even share with us some of those places where you have that sense, where you've been asking yourself that question: what in God's name is going on here? Because I'm confused and this is confusing. And what
Yep.
you said today, like, it matters how things are done. It matters.
Yep.
God cares about that
Yep.
when it comes to the little things and even the big things. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send us a message or an email or just a comment. We'll try and get to all of those. But it was good. Thanks for listening. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks, Annika.
Even in your ADD moments, I mean, it's still so good.
I have a very good friend. I mean, I adore Kenty Carlson. I spoke at a conference where he was kind of with me and introducing me, and about after the third talk, he introduced me, sit up there on a stool with me, and he started the whole thing by saying, "Do you notice that Dave doesn't even finish a sentence? He doesn't finish a sentence." He doesn't sometimes finish a word, and I still understand him, and I don't know how. I know
Well,
it's embarrassing.
Kent, this one's for you. This one's for Kenty.
This one's for Kenty. Yeah, there's like 5 million examples of seeing a squirrel in the middle of a talk.
Okay. Well, we will see you at the next episode, which will be number 5. Till then, hope that you leave us a comment or send us a message. See you
Yep.
later.
Bye.